Ahoy, me mateys! The final pirate video. Pirate talking about Rime of the Ancient Mariner. I guess I should turn this on off for my pirate stereo. Alright, this will be a discussion of themes and ideas. Hopefully it'll go pretty quickly. But since we're talking about literature, I'm going to use my impression of somebody speaking in a futuristic voice. Again, like a robot, a little effeminate, but I'll try to be futuristic so I can sound smarter. We're going to start off talking about, with a vocabulary word, liminality. I'll put it down there in the little descriptions of how to spell it. The reason I bring up this word is because about all I remember from when I first read it in college, the professor talking about liminality. And I have to look it up every time I read this year. But basically the idea is, or the meaning of liminality is between two different worlds. So humans occupy a special place between two different worlds, and I believe Coleridge uses this motif of liminality, or like having one foot in one world, another foot in another world, existing somewhere at the same time, to capture this idea that humans occupy a special place in the world. So, the place, I'll define it as, I'll explain that the Rime of the Ancient Mariner has us between the spirit world and the rational physical world all around us. So you've seen this when we read the Epic of Gilgamesh with the Enkidu story. Enkidu begins as an animal. He lives out with the animals, and then he is, oh, you like that story? And then he is invited into the human world by Shamhat. So he spends 7 days and 7 nights with this representative of a god. And then after they're done making their sweet love for 7 days and 7 nights, Shamhat looks at Enkidu and says, Enkidu, you are just like a god. And then she takes Enkidu, or she says, come, I will take you to the temple of Anu and Ishtar. So there's this idea that human beings are somewhere between animal and godliness, or with the liminality, there's this idea that something's going to happen that we're approximating godliness. The same idea, or the same idea is communicated in the Adam and Eve story, and we went through how Genesis is influenced by some of the ideas that show up in the Epic of Gilgamesh. You almost have like a verbatim story of the Noah's Ark story with Ut and Pishtim. And you see a lot of similarities between the Adam and Eve story and the Enkidu story, where Adam and Eve are put into this garden. They're living this like primordial existence like animals, eating freely from every tree in the garden except for the tree of the knowledge of good and evil and the tree of life. So the serpent tells Eve that if she eats from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, that she will become like a god. And she says, God told us we'll die, and the serpent says, no, you won't die, you'll become like a god. So she and Adam eat from the knowledge of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, and God looks at him and says, oh my God, you'll become like one of us. Don't know who he's talking to, Perry. But there's this idea that human beings are more than animals. They're elevated to this godly status. So God kicks Adam and Eve out of the garden so they won't eat from the tree of life and presumably be just like him. So there's this idea in both of those stories that we are somewhere between animal and approximating godliness. The Romantics invert this, as you've seen with poems. They associate our animal natures with more of a spiritual godliness nature, and our rational minds take us away from this way of understanding, this spiritual way of understanding the world, which is interesting that it's inverted from the Adam and Eve and Enkidu stories. But in the Rime of the Ancient Mariner, you have the emphasis on this like liminal state that humans exist in. Coleridge brings up the equator 3 different times in the story, this like between spot between hemispheres. The main thrust of the story starts right when they hit the equator. That Mariner is talking to the wedding guest, and he says, it's when we hit the equator that a big storm comes and blows us down into Antarctica, where all like the action of the story starts. You have the story opening with that epigraph that we need to find a balance between the invisible natures and visible natures of this world. That if you get too preoccupied with just studying the rational physical world, you get bogged down in trivialities. But if you get too far gone studying like the invisible natures of the spiritual world, you won't be tied down to reality at all. So there's this idea that you need to strike a balance between the spiritual world and or contemplation of the spiritual world and the scientific physical world. His voyage, the Ancient Mariner's voyage, kind of goes through both worlds. He begins to see the spirits once he kills the albatross, and then that spirit from the South Pole starts to plague his ship, kills everybody, and then he's given to not death, but life in death. So he's at this in-between state between like existing in our normal existence and being able to see into the spiritual world. And then you also have the character of the hermit at the end, this holy hermit who lives outside of society but likes to talk to people. He also lives in this like Garden of Eden type existence where he kneels down on like a cushion of moss to pray, and he lives outside of society but he still interacts with society. Let's see here. Oh, and he brings up something interesting too. When I was reading it, I talked about his description of the ship, and he says the ship's sails look like dead leaves, and then he goes off on this weird tangent. He says, like, in the wintertime, when the owlet whoops at the wolf who eats the she-wolf's young. Again, I don't know if the owl's eating the she-wolf's young, or the wolf is eating the she-wolf's young, or a male wolf is eating female, whatever is happening there. Baby puppies are getting murdered. So there's this inference that, like, nature exists, and there is some spirituality to nature, but it doesn't conform to good and evil like human beings build their communities around. That we have this special insight into the way the world works that sets us above the animal world. Okay, so if you're going to be between the spiritual world and the physical world, I guess I should talk about what I mean by the spiritual world for a minute. So Coleridge begins with that epigraph that says, I readily believe there are more invisible forces and visible forces in the world, but who will to explain to us these invisible beings, is what he says. Okay, so it's argued, many people argue about this, whether there is actually some invisible spiritual force that exists in the world, or whether humans just made that up, and it's a byproduct of our giant brains and imaginations. The existentialist view would be that we evolved randomly on this rock we call Earth, and we evolved these brains that helped us survive, and a byproduct of this evolution is that we make up stories and give our lives meaning. The romantic view is that there's actually something there that exists, some truth outside of us that guides our existence. So regardless of where you fall in the spectrum, existentialist or romantic view, it still is worthwhile to look at the motivations and inspiration come from this very hard to determine place. Even the most existentialist, strict scientific Richard Dawkins thinker has a hard time explaining exactly where emotion and intuition, inspiration and motivation come from. So it is worthwhile to look into these, and you do have sciences like psychology or social sciences trying to explain like what these motivations are, and they're not easily attainable results. So it's good to think about this, even if you're far from the romantic thinking. But the romantic view is that, yes, there is some force out there that guides our actions or gives us inspiration. Humans exist somewhere between this godlike and animal state, and part of our godliness is that we can hear this voice or this inspiration calling to us and guiding us to create our communities like according to right and wrong, so that we can build the best society that we possibly can. In the story, or in the Rime of the Ancient Mariner specifically, you have like the three spirits I mentioned before. They're guiding the boat, they're dictating what happens to the mariner himself. The mariner ends with this idea that like all of nature is a physical manifestation of God's will. He ends his tale with like the moral of the story basically is, what's this quote? "For the dear God who loveth us, he made and loveth all." This idea that it's good for us to understand that everything around us was created by God, and we should, in our communities, love each other and love everything that in the world that God's created. So you get this really dark story that ends with this like, the most important thing I can teach you is that life is important and we should respect that in our communities. So the story, like the poem, like many stories, tries to give insight into this: how do we give a good life? And at the end of the story, the mariner concludes his tale by telling the wedding guest, basically like you should look past just the physical world that you see around you and try to find some meaning. So through contemplating like the meaning of the world, we find he ends on this idea that like we should love each other and we should practice in our communities and our worship that everything is sacred. What's neat about, so the mariner ends his story and says like the moral of my story is this, but then you still have that whole thing with the wedding guest and the mariner. What's interesting is you have, so that story within the story, then you have this other idea that the mariner holds this magical power over other people who need to hear the story. So he like charms people. What I think is interesting about this is the insight it gives into, or an explanation for like what charisma is. So we use the term charisma a lot, but basically what it is like some animal magnetism. You start getting into some strange words when you talk about charisma. It seems to be more of like a spiritual appeal thing than just like a physical attractiveness. So according to the Rime of the Ancient Mariner, you can interpret the mariner's glittering eye that holds people still, or a strange power of speech, as resulting from something he's learned. So his charisma, or his ability to capture and captivate people with his words, comes from having learned a universal truth or an important truth about the world, and his need to share it is what holds people in there. I always think about, as an English teacher, teaching and writing, like you can teach imagery tricks and metaphors and how to use all sorts of figurative language, but really the only thing that works if you're teaching people how to write is getting them to find something they care about, and then the metaphors, the imagery, all that other stuff kind of results from somebody just having something to say, which is similar to the mariner in the Rime of the Ancient Mariner. He learns something, he has some insight that he feels really needs to be shared, and then when he shares it, people can't help but be captivated by his story and keep listening to it even if they have other things to do. And what's neat about this story is, or about the mariner's story, is this story has the power to change the world for the better, and it's almost as if he's inspired, like, the world is not complete unless I tell my story. So again, it mirrors like William Blake's idea that the job of an artist is to take insights that the artist has gained into the world and communicate them to people to make the world a better place. And I think that's where we end, Perry. I hope you enjoyed, or that's fun if you watched all these. I guess I'll go out on the pirate way. Goodbye, mateys. I'll catch you on the other side of our COVID vacation, or COVID quarantine.